Kia ora everyone, my name's Zach, I love rugby. Welcome back to Hakatime Rugby. Guys, I'm continuing the preview series. This is episode number 2, and right now we are looking at the scrum, the line-out, the set piece. And we know how important it is. I mean, just look at the game over the weekend, where the game was turned on its head based on the introduction of this man, Ox in Chur, who just started to dominate the scrums. And Springboks were able to build territory advantage on the basis of that, win penalties in key areas, and score points and ultimately come over the top of England. It is a key weapon in rugby these days, guys. So in this video, I am going to outline who has the stronger of the line-out or the scrum, how they're going to use their advantages in those two areas, and ultimately what the other can do to mitigate some of those disadvantages where we see them. This is going to get technical. I'm going to look at numbers and I'm going to look at tactics, guys. So strap in and get ready for this one because it's a huge area for success for either team if they are to win the Rugby World Cup. Straight into it. Let's look at the numbers, and this is line-out percentage victories during the Rugby World Cup. And as you can see here, from a line-out percentage perspective, the All Blacks have had a really, really strong campaign. Now, when we look at these numbers between the Rugby World Cup numbers, it is important to qualify that the Springboks have had the harder opposition, but it does show really importantly that the All Blacks have really, really efficient operations at line-out time. So you can see here, very low loss record. They've lost 2 line-outs of their own line-outs during this Rugby World Cup. Conversely, they've managed to win 19 lineouts from the opposition. That's a big differential. So ultimately, if we look at it in basic terms, the All Blacks are losing 1 lineout every 3 games currently in RWC versus they're able to steal up to 3 lineouts per game also during this RWC. Again, we will weight it with the opposition, given that there are a number of 100 percentages performances here, as you can see with various teams, although a really, really good performance there against Ireland, both in terms of maintaining their own ball and stealing ball from Ireland a couple of times during that game. So, you know, the All Blacks lineout is operating really, really efficiently, and I think with that combination of Scott Barrett, Brodie Retallick, and Sam Whitelock off the bench with other jumpers supporting like Shannon Frizzell, you know, it's really, really operating well right now. So that's going to be a huge advantage for the All Blacks. I think they'll be looking to really utilize those advantages in the lineouts. If we go to the Springboks, still operating at a good clip. So obviously, you know, if we look at the numbers here, Springboks are losing between 1 or 2 lineouts per game on their own throw. So you can see a total of 10 lineouts they've lost during this Rugby World Cup, so 81 to 71 in terms of total lineouts versus total 1. But they're still able to steal sort of 3 lineouts per game from opposition. So it very much is a defensive weapon for the Springboks. They're able to take lineouts from the opposition, but they do need to focus on securing their own lineout. I think the All Blacks will see that there are some opportunities there and will be looking to attack those areas. Now, if we look to the next thing, I've looked at 4 games that the All Blacks and the Springboks have played in this last cycle. So go back to Mbombela and that big game in Johannesburg that the All Blacks were able to win in the 2 lead-up games this year, one in Mount Smart in Auckland, the other in London, where the Springboks were a dominant victory. What we can see here is there's not a lot to choose between the two. So the Springboks are stealing roughly 2 lineouts in each of these games, and the All Blacks have a slightly more efficient defensive posture here from a lineout perspective, stealing between 2 and 3 lineouts on that border of 2.5 per game throughout these 4 games. So I'm going to conclude that the All Blacks probably have more opportunities at lineout time to steal ball based on current form, based on previous meetings between these 2 games. And if we just look to the eye test of the last couple of games, the All Blacks lineout has been operating really, really efficiently, and the Springboks lineout has operated efficiently on their own ball, but there have been opportunities that England and others were able to steal or disrupt lineout ball there. So the All Blacks will probably see that as an area that they can really target. And how should they target? Let's jump over to the view of the game. I want to run through some examples here, guys. So a couple of ways that the All Blacks use their line out, right? We'll start with this game against Ireland. And this one probably shows perfectly why teams are going for shorter lineouts and why there is space in behind. So if we translate this forward, we have a short line out here, and keep an eye on Dan Sheehan here and number 4 here. See that gap in between these two players? That's an area that the All Blacks are looking to exploit. There are also gaps between those that are involved in the lineouts and those that are back in the defensive line, because there's roughly 10 meters between the lineout players and those that are back in the defensive line. That opens up gaps either side that the All Blacks are currently exploiting. So if we run this one through, what you can see here is that the throw will come over, it comes down, and then boom. If we just freeze it here, obviously Richie Mo'unga has the ball. We know what happens here. He goes through the line. But the big threat here is Will Jordan on the inside. That lock that we spoke about is sitting just over here, right? And Dan Sheehan is here. But look at the space between the defenders, between Josh van der Flier standing over here, Dan Sheehan, as well as the covering defense from Jamison Gibson Park. Now, if we roll this forward, what you will see is they're unable to close that gap fast enough. They're worried about the inside runner in Will Jordan. And because of that reason, Mo'unga goes through. We know what happens here. He offloads. Try time Will Jordan. So what the All Blacks are doing is manipulating that space in and around the lineout to try and get an advantage. They're using dummy runners like a Will Jordan in order to draw away the defense. And these kinds of plays are definitely coming against the Springboks. Another variation of this, same kind of setup, short lineout. The first thing to look at is Finlay Christie is here, and we've got the lock here is going to target him. So I think it's Lavanini there. Oh, no, it's the replacement lock. So he comes out the line and targets there. What happens here is there is a big gap here between these two players. That is the space that they're going to look to exploit here. And as we translate that forward, bang. Big gap left there by this player who took the bait, went after Finlay Christie. Will Jordan running that same line. This time they opt for him as the attacking player, and straight through he goes. We know that he puts on a nice little kick here at the end and scores a try, but it's all about manipulation of the space between those defenders. There is that big gap from the defending players through to those that are involved in the lineout. The All Blacks are looking to target those areas. So that's one thing that the Springboks need to be aware of. Let's look at how the Springboks are manipulating and utilizing the lineout. So I'm going to look at this example here during this game against England. One thing to remember here is that the Springboks set this up by just constantly going to the maul. And that threat of the maul is something that opposition teams are really, really worried about. Now, the Springboks are setting up here as if they're going for the maul, right? And the first thing Billy V is doing here is he's looking at that threat, looking when does he need to, trying to make a decision of when he needs to get involved in this lineout. Ultimately, he commits, and exactly at that time, out pops Dion Fury. So what they're doing is using the threat of the maul and providing variation in their attack to catch defenses off guard. He gets a good roll on here, makes good meters. Unlucky not to score there with that second attempt. Ultimately goes to Ajay Sneeman, who's able to score, a really, really important try in the context of that game. Let's go forward to this one. This was against the All Blacks in London, and similar kind of thing here, right? So the setup is done. It looks like it's going to be an option of going for the maul there. And what happens? They bring the ball down, and then out pops Sia Khaleesi. The All Blacks are not ready for it because they're too worried about the maul. It goes to Malcolm Marx. He goes over the line. So this is another use of the lineout. It's lineout variation. It's using the threats that the Springboks have in order to draw in the defenses to then try and utilize and manipulate space. The lineout efficiency is going to be important because it sets up a number of these attacking opportunities that these two teams are going to go for. So we're going to keep a close eye on that, and I think there's real opportunities for both teams to exploit space in and around the lineout. Let us jump back to the numbers because it's time to look at the scrum. Firstly, we'll look at the comparison in the 4 games that these two have played. So not a lot to choose between them, right? So ultimately, the Springboks disrupt the All Blacks feed once, 1.5 to 5 per game. The All Blacks are disrupting the Springboks once per game. So in these clashes, it's relatively close. In terms of a scrum perspective, you would have to say the Springboks have the more dominant scrum, which I think no one would argue with. In terms of the RWC, the Rugby World Cup, the All Blacks have actually gone reasonably well at scrum time here, so operating at 86% versus 62% for their opposition. So they are really putting their opposition under pressure, disrupting, just slight of once per game, but let's say once per game, and then the All Blacks disrupting opposition scrums at 2 per game. Again, we'll weight it with opposition. The Springboks have certainly had the harder run in terms of opponents that they've faced. Conversely, if we look at the results from the Springboks perspective, they are really disrupting opposition scrum. So 3 scrums per game. I mean, you just look at the numbers against England, who are operating at 42% from scrum percentage on the right here. So the Springboks use this as a weapon. We've seen them engage teams by calling the mark, the scrum off the mark. We've seen it twice now in the last 2 games. And what's really interesting here, if we look at these two, is look at the total number of scrums, right? So 45 of their own, 48 of opposition versus the All Blacks 36-29. So the All Blacks are actively trying to engage less at scrum time, and the Springboks are actively trying to engage more at scrum time. We all have to concede that the Springboks have the stronger scrum, although it is, it's relatively marginal. I think the All Blacks would certainly fancy their chances there. But the All Blacks are not looking to engage at scrum time. The Springboks are looking to engage at scrum time. And that is going to be a massive point I want to raise in the winning of this game, guys. And I want to look at something called ball and play, right? A lot has been made by Fozzie about ball and play, and obviously coaches have clapped back at Fozzie saying, which game would you like to see? They were comparing the game between Ireland and the Springboks. It was only 27 minutes in play. What we've seen from the All Blacks is 41 minutes of ball and play against Ireland and 43 minutes of ball and play against Argentina. The All Blacks are actively looking to restrict the amount of scrums that are taking place, and they're doing it a couple of ways, right? The first thing they're doing is they are attacking for long phases. If we saw against Ireland, it was 30 phases before the All Blacks took their first 3 points. It was so much effort put into winning those first 3 points. On the other side, 37 phases of defense, all right? The All Blacks are looking to engage in long phases because it does 2 things. 1, it reduces the number of scrums. 2, it tires out the opposition. 3, it reduces the impact of the scrum weapon. And I think that is exactly what the All Blacks are going to try and do. They're going to try and keep tight, keep connected, and play with the ball in hand for long periods to try and mitigate the threat of the scrum. What we're going to see from the Springboks is try to engage the All Blacks, right? We've seen that they will call a mark and call a scrum if required. Now, it's going to be interesting if they're going to go for that tactic, because what we have seen is that the Springboks have had real advantages in the scrum against England, and had an advantage there, I think, against France as well. Albeit we're trying to engage to try and reduce the impact of the ball over the top, the kick over the top. So how they use that is going to be really, really interesting, and how they choose to engage will be really interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something kind of interesting like Rassie Erasmus, obviously calling for the scrum off the mark. Do they even try to knock the ball on themselves in order to engage in scrums? I wouldn't put anything past the Springboks innovation and what we see from Rassie and Jacques Nienaber. But what I know will happen is that the All Blacks are going to try and keep the ball in play for long periods of time to reduce the prevalence of the scrum. The other thing we haven't talked about is that the All Blacks are making far less errors now in the last 2 games than we've seen. 0 errors against Ireland. There was 1 error each half against Argentina. So the number of opportunities for scrums has been greatly reduced by the All Blacks. One other thing that I want to cover off before we close this video out, it is the way that the refs police and assess the scrums. Now, you'll hear a term, which is kind of a cliche term, called painting a picture, The Springboks are very good at painting pictures for the ref to operate on. So there were a number of those scrums that you thought, well, maybe it shouldn't have been a penalty. There were a couple sideways, I think, well, at least one sideways scrum where I think I've heard a lot of debate about whether or not that was a penalty or not. It doesn't matter, because ultimately there is a picture that's painted for the ref. The ref has it in their mind where the dominance is coming from, and the ref rewards that picture in terms of dominance. And that is just a natural reaction from a ref. What I will say going into this game is Ox in Chair's heroics will be very prevalent in the mind of any ref that is refereeing this game. So they will automatically be looking, or at least favoring the Springboks in terms of the scrum battle. There's going to be a really, really interesting point to follow on here, because I do think that it is something that referees do. It happened between the All Blacks and Ireland, right? Ultimately, Andrew Porter was pushing in sideways, and that was something that was known in advance, and referee Wayne Barnes was policing that immediately. And I think the All Blacks got away with a couple of those scrums more because of the picture that had been painted in Wayne Barnes' mind to date. I can tell you already that any ref will have in their mind the look of this guy on the left, right, and the dominance that he has had previously. So it's going to be fascinating how this plays out. But to summarize, the All Blacks have the advantage at lineout for me. The Springboks have a slight advantage at scrum time for me. And it's going to come down to whoever can engage the other in their key strengths. I'm going to leave it there, guys. I've covered a lot of detail. We've got quite technical in this one, but that's how I see this playing out, right? It's going to be a real battle between engagement in the scrums or disengagement with high ball and play minutes. If you like this video, guys, hit like, subscribe to the channel. I've got a couple more of these preview videos that I'm going to be doing, and let's look forward to this game. Talk soon.